Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is What's Left. My name is Larry Erickson. I'm the host of the show. And for about the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about a couple of things that hopefully you'll be interested in. If you have any reactions to the show, send them to me directly. My personal email's right here. This is whoviating@aol.com. That's me. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here a couple of times during the show. Leave a comment there. If you do send me email, just please include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. So I'll get all that usual stuff out of the way, and we'll get to the show. I always like to start where I can with some good news, and I got some this week, although the first one is kind of a good news, bad news kind of thing. In 2013, the city of Miami, Florida, sued Bank of America and Wells Fargo, charging that their practice of targeting low-income Black and Latino homeowners for riskier mortgages that have less favorable terms ultimately drove a wave of defaults and foreclosures, leading to a fall in property values in the city, and thus a loss in city revenues just at the time the city had to deal with spending more money because of a rash of blighted or abandoned homes. The good news is that on May 1st, the Supreme Court ruled 5-3 that yes, the city of Miami can be an aggrieved person under the Fair Housing Act and so can sue the banks. The bad news part is that for the city to actually prove damages under the law, there's a rather high bar because of the difficulty of showing that the bank's lending practices were the proximate cause of the decline in city revenues, because so many economic and social issues and factors can affect the value of a city's housing stock. It can be hard to determine what effect the bank's practices had. But even so, even despite that, establishing the fact that cities can be victims of these predatory lending practices, that they can be victims of bank-driven housing discrimination, which adds a weapon, even if it's a weak one, into the arsenal that cities can use to try to get recompense from these banks. You got to consider that good news. Now, another bit of lawsuit-related good news is that Kim Davis can also be sued. Now, in case you've forgotten, Kim Davis is the Kentucky County Clerk who had her 15 minutes of fame in 2015 when she refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples after the Supreme Court decision recognizing those marriages nationwide. She claimed that her religion would not let her do it. She ultimately served time in jail for contempt of court and allowed herself to be used as a tool of the right-wing bigots. Well, last year, a district court judge dismissed 3 lawsuits against Davis, arguing that a new law in Kentucky, which excused county clerks from having to sign marriage licenses, mooted the issue because those people could now get those licenses. However, one of those cases was that of David Ermold and David Moore, who were not seeking an injunction demanding that Davis do her job, but were seeking damages against her for refusing to. On May 2nd, a 3-judge panel of the 6th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals overturned the district court ruling in that case, finding that Kentucky's new law did not undo the harm or the past harm that Davis may have done to the couple by refusing to issue the license. So their suit against Davis can continue. The couple's attorney expressed confidence that his clients will prevail and get damages, which frankly I hope they do, because there needs to be a price, some kind of price. There needs to be a price for bigotry. And as a footnote to that, since you're talking there about LGBTQ rights, I wanted to mention the case of Wyoming Senator Mike Enzi. At a visit to a high school on April 25th, he was asked by a student who reminded him that Wyoming is, by its slogan, the equality state, and asked him what he was doing to better the lives of LGBTQ people in his state. Now, Enzi's answer rambled on about civility, and suggested that LGBTQ folks wouldn't have a problem if they just kept quiet about it. In fact, he said, and this is a quote, "I know a guy who wears a tutu and goes to bars on Friday night and is always surprised that he gets into fights. Well, he kind of asks for it." Now, Enzi was backtracking madly by the next day, but it was already too late. People from all over the state of Wyoming, both men and women, were putting on colorful tutus and going out to bars, restaurants, and other establishments and posting the pictures on social media under the hashtag #LiveAndLetTutu. And guerrilla theater lives again. All right, next, speaking of theater and protests and so on, it was an exciting couple of weeks, even encouraging weeks for a lot of us, because they showed that people were, in fact, prepared to prove that the resistance, no, contrary to some have claimed, the resistance is not fading. First, there was April 15th, traditionally tax day, but on this one, tens of thousands of people marched to demand that Donald the Rump release his tax returns, as well as for increased transparency in governance and a fair tax system that does not favor the wealthy. Actions were planned at 192 cities and towns spread across 44 states and the District of Columbia. The two largest turnouts were 25,000 in D.C. and 20,000 in New York, and with several other places reporting turnouts in the thousands or the hundreds, the prediction of organizers that 100,000 people would take part total across the country, they may well have hit that mark. Then on April 22nd, there was the one that was sort of a surprise, in that it was generated by an unusual constituency for mass public action: scientists. What was originally billed as the Scientists' March on Washington, within a few weeks grew from a single post on Reddit to a coalition of about 100 organizations, many of them devoted in some way to science or education or the environment, calling for a March for Science. So on April 22nd, Earth Day, people took part in over 600 marches and events, including 200 of those outside the United States, to express support for scientific research and the scientific method. And again, the turnout was impressive. Based on news accounts, there were tens of thousands in Washington, in Philadelphia, and in San Diego, thousands in Seattle, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, thousands St. Paul, Minnesota, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, more than 1,000 in Gainesville, Florida, hundreds in Nashville, Tennessee, and Montpelier, Vermont. Hundreds, scores, dozens in other places across the country and around the world to celebrate knowledge and to light candles against the darkness. And if April 22nd didn't convince you that the resistance lives, April 29th damn well should have. More than 200,000 showed up in Washington, D.C. for the People's Climate March, far outstripping the organizers' prediction of 50 to 100,000. The march began at 12:30 p.m., and by 2 p.m., the organizers had achieved their goal of surrounding the White House. The march was so huge that people who had been at the very, very front of the march were starting to drift away from the event by the time the end of the march actually got started. And even though the focus of the organizing was on getting people to D.C., there were hundreds of events spread across nearly all 50 states, from the Aleutian Islands to Miami. Early estimates were that there were about 50,000 people who marched or rallied in addition to those in Washington, D.C., a number that may well have been conservative, with marches in all the major cities, Seattle, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Diego, all the usual places, the list goes on, along with cities and towns across the country. And even that figure does not include the people who turned out around the globe in support of this: Japan, the Philippines, New Zealand, Uganda, Kenya, Germany, Greece, United Kingdom, Brazil, Mexico, Costa Rica, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Portugal, Ireland, Sweden, all joining together to say, in what was sort of an unofficial slogan of the event, "There is no planet B. The resistance lives and it grows." Our next up, one of our occasional features, this is called The Little Thing. And that's where something in a news report that strikes me as significant or revealing is either ignored or underplayed or overlooked. The latest case arose in coverage of Hillary Clinton's coming out party, her interview on MSNBC on Tuesday. In that interview, she referred to what she called the unprecedented interference by Russia with the election. She then went on to say, and this is a quote, "I was on the way to winning until a combination of Jim Comey's letter on October 28th and Russian Wikileaks raised doubts in the minds of people who were inclined to vote for me but got scared off." Now, there are actually several things that could be the basis for comment here, such as the persistence of the it was somebody else's fault, it was everybody else's fault, that has been a meme of the Democrats since the election. Her continued studied unawareness of the fact that, with regard to the WikiLeaks, it wasn't the fact that those documents were leaked, it was what was in those documents that was damaging to her. And considering our own well-documented effort to control the outcomes of various elections in various countries, it's rather disingenuous to call Russian interference unprecedented. But that still leaves the little thing, which lies in her statement that she lost because of, quoting again, Jim Comey's letter on October 28th and Russian WikiLeaks. Now, did you catch that? Know that if you didn't catch it, you have made the Democratic Party establishment and its partisan sycophants and insider wannabes who make up far too much of what passes for the left in this country, you've made them very happy. It's the phrase Russian WikiLeaks, which not only declares that Russia was the unquestionable source of those leaks, which, and as a sidebar, I'd have to say that if this was a civil case where the preponderance of the evidence is the standard, I'd have to say that, yeah, at least some of those leaks were done that way, came from there. But if this were a criminal case where the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, I'd have to say, no, you have not proved your case. But anyway, the point is, the phrase Russian WikiLeaks not only connects the leaks directly to Russia, it connects WikiLeaks directly to Russia. And indeed, that's been a theme that the Democratic Party establishment and the faux lefties who think that being not a Republican is a sufficient qualification. Remember that when WikiLeaks published documents embarrassing to the Bush administration, it was a hero. When it released footage useful in opposing the Iraq War, it was a hero. But as soon as WikiLeaks started releasing documents that were more embarrassing to the Barack Obama administration, these same people stood by and watched as the amazing Mr. O tried to break the organization by blocking its access to donations. And this past fall, when the group released documents embarrassing Hillary Clinton, well, that was it. Obviously, WikiLeaks is part of some anti-American cabal. I have actually had some true believers tell me in so many words that Julian Assange is and always has been Putin's agent. Although actually the term used was rather more colorful and actually homophobic, so I won't use it here. The point is, the Democrats and their faux lefty partisans have tried to turn WikiLeaks in the public mind into nothing but an extension of the Kremlin. Its word to be doubted, its revelations, particularly if they're embarrassing to the Democrats, to be ignored. The fact that the phrase Russian WikiLeaks can be used so casually and produce so little response is a sign that that meme is starting to take hold. And that, frankly, is not a little thing. Next, this is one of our regular weekly features. This is the outrage of the week. And this is I expect it's going to be a short one because it really doesn't require a whole lot of explanation. But it's something that I just find so grossly offensive, so appallingly, not even immoral, but amoral, that I'm just floored by it. There is a new thing, or at least it's new in my awareness, a thing called stealthing, in which during sex, straight and gay men are removing their condoms without the knowledge or consent of their partners. According to a study by Alexandra Brodsky, published in the most recent issue of the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law, there's a whole online community of men encouraging one another to carry out what one victim of it called this rape-adjacent act. That is, it's right next to rape, and offering advice and suggestions on how to get away with it. The study quotes comment strings from such sites which defend stealthing as a male right, particularly a right of every man to spread his seed, regardless of the desires of his partner and regardless of if that partner is female or male. Which means if the sex of your partner doesn't matter, that spreading your seed has nothing to do with procreation, but it's clearly about the power, the dominance, the control involved, and if those terms sound familiar, they should, because that's also what's involved in rape. To me, the only difference is that stealthing involves dominance by deception and the sense of having humiliated your partner by having gotten away with it, by having successfully tricked them. In a recent case, Switzerland's High Court ruled that stealthing is rape, and a man was convicted on that basis. But in the U.S., stealthing technically is not defined as a form of sexual assault. In her study, Brodsky spent a fair amount of time trying to define legal terms of how stealthing can be defined as a form of sexual assault, which is understandable. She was writing in a legal journal. But I'm not a lawyer. And I'm not writing in a legal journal, so I don't have to get caught up in those sort of legal technicalities. So I have no problem in saying, of course stealthing is sexual assault, of course it is sexual violence, of course it is rape. And of course, those who engage in it, particularly those who brag about having gotten away with it, are scumbag lowlifes. And of course, it is an outrage. All right, one quick last thing before we go to break. It's everything you need to know. It's one of our occasional features. This is where you can learn a great deal about something in a very short time. In this case, it's everything you need to know about the Rump's commitment to reproductive rights in just 2 words. Teresa Manning. See, Teresa Manning is an anti-abortion fanatic who has argued that contraception doesn't work, that insists there is a link between abortion and breast cancer, even though no such link exists, and who was opposed to federal family planning funding. Teresa Manning is now to be in charge of a federal family planning program for low-income Americans. Teresa Manning, that's everything you need to know. And we are taking a break. And we are back. And we're back with For the Record, where we cover something relatively briefly just to make sure that it does get included. So for the record, back in January, Desiree Fairooz, an activist with Code Pink, was in the rear of the audience for the confirmation hearings on Jeff Sessions for Attorney General. When Senator Richard Shelby claimed that Sessions has, quote, an extensive record of treating all Americans equally under the law, Fairooz laughed, which, considering how nonsensical that assertion is an entirely understandable reaction. She was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct intended to impede, disrupt, and disturb congressional proceedings, and with parading in the Capitol, which evidently because she held up a sign she was carrying while she was being dragged out. The laugh was a one-off and indeed is barely audible on C-SPAN's video of the hearings. There were coughs that were louder, and Shelby did not even pause in his statement. Despite that, on May 3rd, she was convicted on both charges and now faces a year in prison and a $2,000 fine for laughing, for having spontaneously laughed at an absurdity, for failing to pretend that Jeff Sessions, who in 1986 was thought too racist to be a federal judge, has an extensive record of treating all Americans equally, for laughing at the lies. All right, then we're going to go to, right from one absurdity to another absurdity. This is the Clown Award, one of our regular features, given as always for meritorious stupidity. And I had 2 that were neck and neck this week, but only one can have the dishonor of the award. So I have to say sorry to, you didn't quite make the cut, and say sorry to Tennessee State Senator Mark Green. He is the Rump's nominee for Secretary of the Army. Green maintains that the purpose of the Second Amendment, despite what it says about being able to maintain a militia, is actually about the citizens being able to overthrow the federal government. Now, he's not the only person operating under that particular delusion, but to give him credit, he is at least willing to go the whole way, insisting that, I'm quoting, the citizenry should be allowed to maintain whatever weapons the federal government has. If they can have an aircraft carrier, I should be able to have an aircraft carrier. So you know that backyard nuke you wanted to build? Totally cool with Mark Green. Oh, by the way, there is talk that he may withdraw his name from the nomination because of opposition, but the opposition isn't over this. It's over the fact that he was not only an extreme gun nut, he's also a raging lunatic on LGBTQ rights, including opposing transgender restroom rights because he has a mission to, quote, crush evil, unquote. But while that ranks high on inanity, it falls short on rank stupidity. So this week, the big red nose goes to Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, who gave a briefing on the federal budget negotiations on May 2nd, where he spent most of his time talking about the border wall with Mexico, even though the amount involved it amounts to literally 0.035% of the budget. During which briefing, he showed a picture of wall construction and then admitted he had no idea where the picture was taken. But what sold his nomination for me was his statement that we are competent and we know what we're doing, which is much like saying I am not a crook, and that if you find the need to say it is really, really, really not a good sign. Except a sign that Mick Mulvaney is a clown. All right, last thing. The big foreign policy issue of late, at least if you go by the headlines, is North Korea. I wanted to offer some of my thoughts on that, a lot of which is, of course, is speculation and interpretation. But I want to say at the top, I have learned over the years to trust my instincts on matters like this, and my instincts are what I'm going on here. So my instincts tell me that this will not result in a war. Now, I have no faith in either the reasonableness or the emotional stability of either Donald the Rump or Kim Jong-un. But in each case, the people around them are at least somewhat grounded in military and political realities. One reality from our perspective being that, North Korea is actually incapable of inflicting significant harm on the United States. In a conflict, they could sink a ship or something, and obviously that would kill soldiers and sailors. But in terms of significant damage to the United States, they simply do not have the capability. However, with an army estimated at 1.2 million, even with its obsolete weaponry, North Korea could inflict significant damage on South Korea, which is something we do not want to see happen. Meanwhile, for their part, the North Korean military knows, it must know, if it doesn't know, the Chinese surely would tell them, that going to war with the U.S. risks national suicide. And China, which surely does not want to get into a war with the U.S., especially over North Korea, could still feel obligated to come to the defense of its ally, which means everybody involved has reason to not want a war. So there won't be a war unless somebody gets stupid. Okay? Stop the jokes. I thought of the jokes. You thought, just leave the jokes aside. By stupid here, I'm talking about getting so focused on what you want to achieve, that you stop thinking about how the other side will react and so wind up getting unintended consequences. All right, with all that in mind, there are a few events in recent days that I think are particularly significant. The first is that in a big break from tradition, Japan's largest warship, the Izumo it's called, is escorting a U.S. supply ship heading to the Korean Peninsula as it passes through Japanese waters. Now, by its constitution, Japan can only act militarily in self-defense, but a new law allows its ships to come to the defense of an ally that's protecting Japan. Which means that Japan is saying by this action that the U.S. fleet gathering off the Korean Peninsula is protecting Japan. Considering the history between Japan and Korea, that is likely to cause consternation in North Korea and raise the specter of a reassertion of Japanese militarism. It can't help but make the North Korean military more on edge. Then what may be the most significant bit of news of the past couple of weeks, on Wednesday, May 3rd, North Korea's state media publicly criticized China. Chinese state media commentaries have been calling for Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program to be shut down and have been suggesting tougher sanctions toward that end. A commentary carried by the official Korean news agency called an undisguised threat against the country. The Korean commentary accused the Chinese government of a string of absurd and reckless remarks and added the Chinese had better ponder the grave consequences of these reckless acts. Now, what is interesting is that the U.S. has been pressing China, which is North Korea's only major ally, to restrain Kim Jong-un's government. And this appears to be clear evidence not only that China is doing that, but that it's having an effect. China cut off all coal imports from North Korea in mid-February, saying that would continue for at least through 2017. And while North Korean economists tried to shrug that off, the fact is coal is North Korea's major export and China is its major customer. All of which means that the recent hostility toward China could be a sign that these things are starting to bite. Now, that could be seen as good news if your intention is to really put the screws to North Korea, but this is actually where you need to be careful. The fact is, historically, when nations feel that their choices come down to war or humiliation, historically they have chosen a depressingly consistent persistence for the former. So the bottom line is that if you don't want war, if you're not trying to provoke a war, then when you have the upper hand, especially when you have the upper hand, you have to give the other side a way to back out without appearing to back down. Which is why I'm concerned about what appears to be an unseemly rush to increase sanctions on North Korea, just as existing sanctions appear to be having an effect. The House just passed by 419-1 a bill that would, if enacted, not only toughen U.S. sanctions against North Korea, but would sanction nations that have certain dealings with North Korea. Now, that supposedly is about North Korea's use of slave labor, not its nuclear weapons program, but I doubt the North Koreans are going to care about that distinction. Pushing too hard, too fast is exactly the sort of stupidity I talked about at the top. So it's still a touchy, tense time, but I believe the leadership of everyone involved, even allowing for the fact that one leader is a sociopathic egomaniac and another is a spoiled brat with delusions of grandeur, and it really doesn't matter which one is which, but the full scope of leadership of each party involved has good reasons to avoid war. All we have to do is find a way to allow Kim and the rump to come out of this with their egos intact. Which is not easily, but certainly not impossible, since both of them have in the past declared their failures to be great victories. All right, that's it for this week. I got to get out of here. I'm just out of time. So for the moment, I'm just going to say you have the best week you possibly can. And I'm going to quote something I saw on a church sign recently. May you always strive to be the person your dog thinks you are. Peace.